14, Power, Influence, and Leadership. Here are the learning objectives for Chapter 14. We'll start off talking about the difference between a manager and a leader. We've used both terms throughout the semester, though we have focused more on managers. We'll see that managers and leaders have different ways of behaving. They could be the same person. Sometimes a person might be more in the role of a manager, sometimes more in the role of a leader. And there's different behaviors between the two. We'll talk about what does it take to be a successful leader, and do effective leaders behave in similar ways. And the fourth learning objective, how might effective leadership vary according to the situation on hand? So the same behaviors might work in one situation but not in another. Learning objective 5, we'll talk about the connection between inspiration and leadership. Can leaders truly inspire people to perform beyond their normal levels? And finally, in learning objective 6, well, we'll look at yourself. If there's many ways to be a leader, which one would describe yourself, the best? So we break the chapter down into 4 different lessons. The first, lesson 1, talk about the nature of leadership. What's the definition of leaders and so on. Lesson 2, we'll talk about power and influence. How do leaders actually operate? What's their sources of power, and how do they influence people? And then lessons 3 and 4, we'll look at several of the different approaches to studying leadership and explaining when leaders might be effective and when they might not be. So here in lesson 1, we'll talk about the nature of leadership and the distinction between leading and managing. We look at the definition of leadership in the textbook. Leadership is the ability to influence employees to voluntarily pursue organizational goals. And we just compare it back to the definition of management that we used earlier. One definition of management we used early in the semester was management is the process of getting things done through others. Now we still see some very big similarities and overlaps. Here we're looking at pursue organizational goals, and in management we had getting things done. So the organizational goal certainly could be getting things done, but in management it was getting things done through others. So it certainly talks about social aspect, dealing with people. Here leadership is the ability to influence employees to voluntarily pursue organizational goals. What we're trying to do is to get people to do something voluntarily. That's the leadership part, getting them to follow you, putting them in a certain direction, getting them to follow those goals. So management is the process of getting things done. Leadership is kind of getting them in motion, getting them to move to pursue those goals. Notice leadership doesn't necessarily talk about getting the goals accomplished. It's getting people to pursue the goals. Management is about getting the goals done. So there we have a little bit of a difference. If we were to break the difference down a little bit more between what managers and leaders do, management is about coping with complexity, and leadership is about coping with change. Now, we've talked a little bit about both of those aspects before, complexity and change. One, we've seen when talking about the environment that the environment is very dynamic and changing, that there's a lot of aspects that managers have to deal with. Those are some of the complexities that we've talked about. Leadership is about coping with change. Remember, we're getting people to voluntarily pursue organizational goals. In one sense, we're displacing individual goals with organizational goals. We're putting people into a certain direction. We're changing them from existing directions to another direction. So again, management is about coping with complexity, dealing with the environment, dealing with the mix within the organization, and getting things done. That's what management does. Leadership is about coping with change, moving that direction that people might follow. So we're seeing some distinctions here. Remember, we talked about the 4 functions of a manager early this semester. Managers lead, control, plan, and organize. And we have talked about planning and organizing before. We'll talk about controlling in the last chapter of the textbook. But here we're looking at lead. And just wanted to kind of back up and reflect. Look at how managers exhibit these functions. We have seen earlier in the semester one of the tables that managers at different levels vary in the proportion of behaviors that they do related to leading, controlling, planning, and organizing. If we looked at managers at the very top of the organization, the CEO, chairman of the board, top management team, vice president, such, they probably do a lot more planning. So we could think about strategic planning. That would be more of a behavior of a very top executive. We could look at managers at the bottom of the organization, the line managers, the frontline managers that are dealing directly with the employees, that are interacting with the customers and the product. And we could see that maybe they might be doing a little bit more controlling and leading. And again, we haven't really talked about controlling in a specific way yet, but the behaviors are going to change a little bit. Now, it's not that they only do leading and controlling, and at the top they only do planning. It's just that the relative proportion or ratio changes a little bit. I just wanted you to kind of pause and think about how different managers you've seen maybe emphasize some of these functions a little bit more than others. Okay, we talked about managers coping with complexity. Here's some examples of some of the complexity that managers will cope with. In determining what needs to be done, managers plan and budget. So budget could be budgeting your people, could be budgeting your equipment, could be budgeting your money. Planning is, again, figuring out in the future what you want to do, where you're going to go and do it. So those two certainly relate to each other. So determining what needs to be done, managers plan and budget. We'll look at the same line with leaders coping with change. In determining what needs to be done, we're not planning and budgeting, we're setting a direction. So we're setting a direction where we're going to lead people. We're going to try and get people to voluntarily follow that. Backing up to the manager here, creating arrangements of people to accomplish an agenda, managers organize and staff. Where if we look at what leaders do, creating arrangements of people to accomplish agenda, talking about aligning people. Again, we're looking at getting that direction, getting people to voluntarily pursue organizational goals, so their goals align with the organization's. So if we're getting the arrangement of people in a certain way, aligning would be more what leaders would do. Organizing and staffing, getting the right people and choosing them, would be what managers do. And if we look at the bottom point here, ensuring people do their jobs, we could do the controlling. Measuring the output, applying feedback, putting in corrective measures, those are some of the controlling. Likewise, problem solving. Seeing if things aren't going according to plan, what do we do with that complex environment that we're dealing with? So managers, when they ensure that people do their jobs, some of the behaviors, some of the actions they look at are controlling and problem solving, where leaders, their behaviors become more motivating and inspiring. So when we talk about managers coping with complexity, we see some actions about determining what needs to be done, dealing with people, ensuring people do their jobs. And when we compare it to leader, we see that's a little bit different. So sometimes it's going to be hard to distinguish as somebody being a manager or somebody being a leader. But we make this division so that we can analyze the behaviors a little bit more clearly at times, so we can have a better understanding about setting a direction, aligning people, motivating and inspiring people. Okay, this is the end of lesson 1. We can end the lesson soon and go on to lesson 2, where we examine power and influence.